Good morning. Welcome back for Lesson 12 in our study of the divided kingdom, hope in Israel's schism. This is our second to last lesson, and we'll see that in today's reading, beginning in 2 Kings 21, things are really coming to a head in the southern kingdom of Judah. So last week we caught up with the southern kingdom after a few weeks being highly absorbed in the story of the northern kingdom of Israel. We started back at the point of Jehu, where the kings of the north and south were allied and intermarried, and Jehu, as he rose to power in the northern kingdom of Israel, destroyed both kings. And so there's, that setback in the houses, and we saw that even in Judah, which is the house of David, it was almost wiped out when a daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, the very bad king and queen of Israel during the time of Elijah, she was the queen mother in Judah, and she killed the entire royal family, her own sons, her own grandsons, maybe, everyone who could have come to power. And it was only through one baby being saved by the priest and the priest's right that the priest's wife, that the line of David was preserved. Okay. And then we followed a succession of good but not great kings in Judah, all of the line of David, while Israel was spiraling downward. Okay. And then, so by the time it's about time for Israel to go into exile, we get to one really bad king in Judah. Who was the worst king up to this point? Look in chapter 16 at the beginning, starting in verse 1. And what was he like?
Are we talking about Ahaz?
Yes, we are talking about Ahaz. What does Ahaz do?
He did not that which was right in the sight of the Lord.
Yeah, he was evil, and he was extra evil in some ways. How was he extra evil?
He sacrificed his son.
Sacrificed his sons.
Yeah. So it talks about how he follows the idolatrous practices of the nations in imitation of Israel. And we've seen that, the distortion of worship into these abusive practices that were present in the worship of the nations. And then the pinnacle of that was this child sacrifice. And the Bible treats that as one of the worst things you can do, one of the greatest distortions of what worship should be. But then Ahaz's son Hezekiah comes to power in chapter 18. The skip is because, the in-between is about Israel. We're still focusing on Judah. And then what is Hezekiah like? 18:1 and following.
He does what's right and tears down everything that's all the idols and everything.
Yeah, and the idols, and what specific did he tear down that nobody else tore down?
The high places.
Right. So he's good, and he's so good that he's like his father David. It says he did what is right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He took down the high places, and it says specifically that he trusted in the Lord and that the Lord was with him. And so during the time that Israel is falling to Assyria, we see Hezekiah delivered from Assyria because of his faithfulness, right? And so it kind of looks like maybe things are looking up in Judah. Maybe they're going to get back on track. Maybe this king that acts like David is going to put them back in the way that they should be before the Lord, right? But then we get, in the end of the Hezekiah story, we get this little piece that I think, kind of foreshadows the rest. So turn to 2 Kings 20. Look at beginning in verse 12. At that time, Merodach-Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent Hezekiah letters and a gift because he heard of Hezekiah's illness. Right. So Hezekiah had been ill. God gave great, he cried out to the Lord. He turned his face to the wall. God had given him reprieve from this illness that would have been fatal otherwise. And he's going to live uh, 15 more years. And so, if we think about the amount of time that it would take for that message to get all the way to Babylon and for him to send the gift back. But, so this over time, this message has happened, and he's going to recover. And then these messengers come from Babylon, verse 13. Hezekiah received the messengers, and this is what should give us a little sense of chilled, right? Some red flags are here, right? And showed them all that was in his storehouses, the silver, the gold, the spices, the fine oil, the armory, and everything found among his treasures. There was nothing in his palace or in all his kingdom that Hezekiah did not show them. What do we think of that?
That's a bit prideful. And didn't Solomon do the same thing?
Solomon did. It's a great observation, and people were just so impressed because it was Solomon. But what do we think about it when Hezekiah does it? Maybe he's trying to be like Solomon. You mentioned kind of the pridefulness. What else? Is this intelligent? Is this wise or foolish?
Well, he's showing them all the stuff that they can then take from him eventually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's a sense of like he didn't have the self-control to hold back, and so he made himself vulnerable by doing this foolish thing, right? So it's dumb and it's self-aggrandizing. We can tell by Isaiah's reaction next that he's doing this outside God's guidance, right? It's all about him and himself, right? Then Isaiah, verse 14, then Isaiah the prophet went to King Hezekiah and asked, what did those men say and where did they come from? From a distant land, Hezekiah replied. They came from Babylon. He's like, they're really far away. Don't worry about them. 15, the prophet asked, what did they see in your palace? Oh, they saw everything in my palace, Hezekiah said. There's nothing among my treasures I did not show them. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your fathers have stored up to this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord, and some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood that will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs or officials. It's the same word. Eunuch sounds a lot more ominous than officials, but we can't tell which is meant there. In the palace of the king of Babylon. Now, how should Hezekiah react to that?
Repent. Be sorry.
Right, yeah. Is this good news or bad news?
Bad news.
Right? He should be viewing this as bad news. This is not okay. How did he react when he was sick and he was going to die?
He prayed.
He immediately prayed for.
Yeah. He wept bitterly. It says he turned his face to the wall. These other times, when he's himself has been in danger, you get these significant emotional reactions to this bad news. But this time, verse 19, he says, the word of the Lord you have spoken is good, said Hezekiah replied. It's not good. Right? Isn't there such a reversal here of our understanding of good and bad, even in this king like David? For he thought, will there not be peace and security in my lifetime? So the new David is a little, well, how would you describe that?
Kind of fallen from grace. He's not.
Yeah, like so many of our kings, the ends of their reigns aren't as pretty as the beginnings. Yeah, what else?
I was just saying that David did. Oh, sorry. Excuse me.
He's not acknowledging God in all those treasures that he had. If he had acknowledged that these were gifts from God, it would have been a lot different. But he said, look what I did, look what I did. Yeah. And now he's thinking, am I going to have peace? Am I going to have security? Who cares about the rest of the generations?
Yeah. it's very self-focused, isn't it? And so we get this little piece, it's pointing us forward to what we know will happen with Babylon, right? Okay, so we had a new David. We thought it was going to reset the people, maybe it was going to fix things, right? But chapter 21, where our reading begins today, is it going to fix things?
Mm-mm.
No, okay.
Sounds like it gets worse.
Right. Carrie, will you read chapter 21, verses 1 through 9? And keep in mind, we thought we had high hopes for the people of Judah after Hezekiah, and then we got that little piece about Babylon, and so now we're going, oh no, and now we get chapter 21.
Manasseh, king of Judah. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 55 years. His mother's name was Hephzibah. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations of the Lord that the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He also erected altars to Baal and made an Asherah pole, as Ahab, king of Israel, had done. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshiped them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." In the two courts of the temple of the Lord, he built altars to all the starry hosts. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced divination, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. He took the carved Asherah pole he had made and put it in the temple, of which the Lord had said to David and to his son Solomon, "In this temple and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. I will not again make the feet of the Israelites wander from the land I gave their ancestors, if only they will be careful to do everything I commanded them, and will keep the whole law that my servant Moses gave them." But the people did not listen. Manasseh led them astray, so that they did more evil than the nations of the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites.
Thank you. Okay, what do we learn about Manasseh?
He's very evil. I think it's very interesting that the pull of Baal worship is so strong that he didn't even apparently learn anything from his father.
So sorry, the electrician was here. I had to answer a question. Yeah, I guess you can't keep the electrician waiting. Could you repeat what you said? I'm so sorry.
No, I just said it seems like the pull of the Baal worship is so strong that they don't learn from their father when he has done good and in the sight of the Lord. It's a lot of the sons have been pulled away. Is it because more Baal?
Well, whiplash, right? See, we had the good King Hezekiah, now we're back. And so how would you categorize Manasseh? What end of the spectrum is he on? Like
The worst end.
Right, we have a new worst king. He's even worse than Ahaz, right? Ahaz was the worst king up to this part, and now we have a new worst king, just right after we had the hopes that things would be better. How long does he reign?
55 years.
So long, right?
I'm concerned that he's only 12 years old when he starts, and what influences were there around him that his father didn't get rid of?
What a great question.
At the end of his father's reign is when his father turned, and it seems like that's what he remembered instead of the beginning of his father's reign when he was a better ruler, king, whatever, at that time.
Maybe so. I think those are great insights. And don't you wonder if didn't Hezekiah have kings earlier in his, have children earlier in his reign? Why was he, why was his heir so young? Were there earlier heirs killed? Like, this is not the information our prophet authors care about, right? That belongs in the chronicles of the annals of the kings of Judah, right? But we wonder how this happened. And we think, like the influences that we surround ourselves with and that we surround the next generation with, they certainly matter. Great points. Yeah, so we get a lot of detail here about his behavior, right? The detestable practices of the nations. We know that stands for a whole suite of idolatrous and sexually abusive behaviors. He rebuilt the high places, like they weren't gone very long, were they? Rebuilt the high places after they had just been removed. These altars to Baal and Asherah, right? This pull of Baal and Asherah is apparently so strong, right? And then he has additional innovations. Who else does he worship? Verse 3.
The story hosts.
The starry host, right? The NIV obscures this in its translation. It will often translate the Lord of hosts as the Lord Almighty. It's the word Sabaoth, the Lord Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts. You'll hear that word Sabaoth in some of our songs. We sang one Sunday morning that had that word in it. It means the Lord of hosts. It's the Lord of the heavenly armies, right? The angel armies of the Lord, or the hosts of the Lord's servants in heaven, right? That the Lord is the Lord of hosts, right? And that phrase is used of the Lord across the Old Testament, but here we see that Manasseh is worshiping the starry hosts, the created rather than the creator, right? And then he also, not only does he worship Baal, but he puts those things in God's temple, right? Where he had put his name, right? That matters to God. And then he added sorcery, divination, mediums, and spiritists. This sort of reminds us back to the very first king of Israel. What did Saul do? Sharon, I see you talking, but you're muted.
He was trying to turn everyone away from Christ and from God.
So Saul really, he lost the Spirit of God, and he was so, he was kind of casting about for what to do, and he went and consulted a medium, just to get this medium to bring up the spirit of Saul. It's a strange story, but we kind of have this set of passages that we're reading tonight. We have these tiebacks to the earlier history of Israel, and so like this, he's added these spirits, sorcery and divination, mediums and spiritists. He's really covering the gamut of ways that a king can go wrong, right?
I have a question. I have a question. He put the Asherah pole in the temple. He put several things in the temple. I don't recall any other king went that far. They would make high places, but is he the first one to desecrate the temple so badly?
I think so. I haven't gone and specifically checked that. We would have to go and double check, but I think he is the first to put those in the Lord's temple in Jerusalem. Right. And we get some more content. Oh, go ahead. You were to say something?
I was just thinking, and there are a lot of sentences devoted to in the temple, in the temple, in the temple. So I'm thinking the writer is really trying to stress that he brought these things into the temple.
Yes. So absolutely. And this is the setup for what's going to go on with the temple in Josiah's reign. So keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to it when we get to Josiah. So yes, definitely, like he's basically defiling God's temple with idol worship. And what is God? There's several phrases in here. You make a great point about what does the temple mean, right? What does this passage say that the temple means?
It's where God dwells. The temple was God's dwelling place, and it had God's name on it.
His name, right? He said, where God said, this is in verse 7, in this temple and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. Right? So for the Lord to put his name there is analogous with God's reputation, his strength and his power. His glory dwells, came and filled the temple when it was dedicated, just as it had filled the tabernacle, right? So this idea that the temple where God had put his name, now Manasseh has put, these idolatrous, all this stuff to go with his idolatry, right, in the temple where the Lord had put his name. What's the point? You mentioned there's a lot of words to that in this passage. What's the author doing? What's the point of, like, for example, 7 through 9?
Well, it's reminding that he had covenant with Israel, and they repeatedly fall away.
Right. So they had that covenant, right? And what was the covenant? I won't make them wander from the land if only
they will follow me.
If only, right? So what we're hearing here is a reminder of the obedience that is required with the covenant, right? It's like they're never going to wander again. The northern kingdom of Israel is already wandering again, right? And we know, because this is not a surprise story, right? The people who are first reading it are in exile, right? So we know that the Judahites will be wandering again. And so we get this reminder that the covenant is conditional on their obedience. They will never wander from the land if only they will be careful to do everything I commanded them and keep the whole law my servant Moses gave them. And it says the people didn't listen either, right? And then we get a really chilling final line in verse 9. What's that about?
They were more evil than the nations they had destroyed.
Right. The nations, that the land was so defiled by them that it vomited them out, we saw in that passage in Leviticus. Well, so what will happen to the Judahites who are now more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before? Yeah. Carrie, will you read 10 through 15?
The Lord said through his servants the prophets, Manasseh king of Judah has committed these detestable sins. He has done more evil than the Amorites who preceded him, and has led Judah into sin with his idols. Therefore, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I am going to bring such disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. I will stretch out over Jerusalem the measuring line used against Samaria and the plumb line used against the house of Ahab. I will wipe out Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. I will forsake the remnant of my inheritance and give them into the hands of enemies. They will be looted and plundered by all their enemies. They have done evil in my eyes and have aroused my anger from the day their ancestors came out of Egypt until this day.
Thank you. So what is the message?
God is angry.
God is angry. And then what? Someone else spoke?
Judah is going to be destroyed.
Yeah, Judah is going to be destroyed. It is over. God has decided. And we see that the standard used against Samaria, so when it says the plumb line, right, that plumb line, that's a standard, right? That's the idea of something that determines if something is plumb, is parallel, is true for building. And so when you put them alongside the truth, when you compare them to the standard, they're done, right? He's going to wipe them out, like the wiping out a dish, right? And then, so who's been saying this? God through
Prophets.
prophet, plural, right? Interesting. And
Right.
look at verse 16. Moreover, Manasseh also shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end, besides the sin that he had caused Judah to commit, so that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. What innocent blood is this? Who's Manasseh killing?
Probably priests and prophets.
Yeah, I think you're right. Mary too. Thank you. Yeah, the sense is when bad kings get bad news from prophets and they don't want to hear it, you know, over and over we've seen that what they want to do is kill them, right? And it seems that Manasseh did. Apparently, a lot of them. Later Jewish tradition is that the prophet Isaiah was killed by Manasseh in this period by being sawn in half. If you read Hebrews 11:32 through 38, it talks about the fate and the suffering of the prophets over the years, and one of the things it mentions is sawn in half. It's a reference to this Jewish traditional story about Manasseh putting Isaiah to death in this way. And also, you know, so definitely, I think definitely what's implied is he's killing the prophets. And then also the mention of Ahab's house makes us think of Ahab killing Naboth for his vineyard, right? How did the text feel about Ahab killing Naboth for his vineyard? Just one guy, not that big a deal. What do you think? Remember how many times it came up again? Remember how the killing, so if you, to refresh from this story, Ahab wanted Naboth's vineyard. It was near his military city, his fort city that he used as a military base, and he wanted Naboth's vineyard for a vegetable garden because it was right next to his wall. And so he asked to buy it, and Naboth, in the exact appropriate response, said, no, you know, far be it from me to sell the inheritance of my ancestors, you know, because God did that. God said each family should keep, God parceled out the inheritance and said everybody should keep it. And so Ahab went and sold, and Jezebel said, don't worry about it. You're the king, you can have whatever you want, remember? And she had false testimony against Naboth, and they took him out and stoned him, and Ahab got his vineyard, right? This is the kind of corruption that we see when the kings stray from God's ways, right? The kind where power corrupts, the kind where if you're a leader, you think you can have anything you want by just taking it, and that you don't have to follow the rule of law, right? When the king is idolatrous, he does not serve the people, he abuses the people. And so we get the sense here, this innocent blood, he filled Jerusalem from end to end, that we have a reign of terror under Manasseh, that he's killing anyone who disagrees with him, and that his corruption is spread to just, you know, abuse of power. Questions or comments on that?
Deanna, what do you make of that bit in 2 Chronicles 33, where Manasseh was captured by Assyria, but then they let him go, and it said that he got rid of the foreign gods and removed the image from the temple of the Lord?
So I'll turn over there.
33:15.
Well,
actually back to 11 or 14, excuse me.
Yeah, the Chronicles kind of rehabilitates Manasseh. So Chronicles is written later than Kings. You know, in our Bibles, we have the history groups, books grouped, and Chronicles is in them. But in the Jewish ordering of the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures or the Hebrew scriptures, Chronicles are not listed in the same place, you know. So when we're like, oh, here's a history book of First and Second Kings. Oh, here's a history book of Chronicles. And they read like you would read them in a row, but they're not set up to do that. And if we ever do, you know, I put on one of our possible future studies, that kind of the unity and structure of the Hebrew scriptures. If we ever do that, we'll look at how elegantly the ordering contributes to the overall meaning of the Hebrew scripture. And Chronicles is actually the final book in the Hebrew Bible. We get this, you know, we've talked about how Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are the former, what they call the former prophets. They're books that are written from the prophetic perspective about the history of the land, but it's a theological history, right? Well, Chronicles is not in that set. We get the other writings, and then Chronicles at the very end. And what Chronicles is doing is kind of re-envisioning the history of the people to point forward to what we'll talk about as to the Messiah, right? To point forward to a new way that God is going to rescue his people, right? And so Chronicles does some things like it only tells Judah's story. It doesn't tell Israel's, right? It's just the southern kingdom. It leaves out the bad things, a lot of the bad things that David and Solomon and, you know, the bad behavior on behalf of those things is not included in Chronicles. Well, is that because they didn't believe it happened or they wanted you to believe it didn't happen? No, it is sort of it's more like a re-envisioning of what Israel's history can mean. And so when we get different stories, like sometimes, you know, you get additional information, you're like, oh, that's helpful. Like, you know, oh, this person was the wife of that person. Hey, good to know. But when we get these sort of very different treatments where Manasseh gets a little rehabilitated and he prays, you know, he has this prayer and he gets rid of the foreign gods, like they're just doing a different thing. And as far as what we consider historically accurate, I don't know. There's every author curates, right? They select the things to include to make their points, as every history book, even a modern history book would do. But in particular, we have the theological points. So that was a really long answer that didn't give you a final conclusion on the matter. Thoughts or comments? I think the thing to remember is that Chronicles is doing a different thing, and that when we read Chronicles, we want to read it like it's the final envisioning pointing forward to the Messiah. Does that help any? Okay, so back to 2 Kings and Manasseh. So Manasseh dies, and he's not buried. Doesn't say he's buried in the tombs of his father David, like some of the other kings have said, right? Instead, he's buried in the Garden of Uzzah. Well, the only Uzzah we know was way back in the time of Samuel, when Uzzah was carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and he reached out and took hold of it when he wasn't supposed to. This irreverent and disobedient act for which the Lord's wrath broke out against him and struck him dead. And so we sort of see this echo in Manasseh, that he is taking hold of and perverting the ways of the Lord in Israel, and that the Lord's wrath is about to break out against him. After Manasseh, his son Ammon reigns, but he's just like Manasseh. And Ammon only reigns 2 years and then is assassinated. That should trigger our pattern notice, right? Because remember how all those kings of Israel, like there would be an evil king and then their evil son would reign 2 years and then someone would kill him and take over. So they're acting just like Israel, and the stuff that's going on is just like the stuff that went on in Israel, right? So this leaves this young son of Ammon to take over for his murdered father, and we get the next king, Josiah. Carrie, will you read chapter 22, verses 1 through 13?
Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. His mother's name was Jedidah, daughter of Adaiah, and she was from Bozkath. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and followed completely the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. In the 18th year of his reign, King Josiah sent the secretary, Jotham, son of Azaliah, and son of Meshullam, to the temple of the Lord. He said, "Go up to Hilkiah the high priest, and have him get ready the money that has been brought into the temple of the Lord, which the doorkeepers have collected from the people. Have them entrust it to the men appointed to supervise the work on the temple, and have these men pay the workers who repair the temple of the Lord, the carpenters, the builders, and the masons. Also have them purchase timber and dressed stone to repair the temple. But they need not account for the money entrusted to them, because they are honest in their dealings." Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the secretary, "I have found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord." He gave it to Shaphan, who read it. Then Shaphan the secretary went to the king and reported to him, "Your officials have paid out the money that was in the temple of the Lord and have entrusted it to the workers and supervisors at the temple." Then Shaphan the secretary informed the king, "Hilkiah the priest has given me a book." And Shaphan read from it in the presence of the king. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. He gave these orders to Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Achbor son of Micaiah, Shaphan the secretary, and Asaiah the king's attendant. "Go and inquire of the Lord for me, and for the people, and for all Judah, about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us, because those who have gone before us have not obeyed the words of this book. They have not acted in accordance with all that is written there concerning us."
Thank you. Okay, so what is Josiah like?
He goes in the way of the Lord. But I have a question. What do you think turns these young kings to the Lord after they've done, he's only 8 years old and he's lived with his father's cruelty and everything. What makes him go with the way of the Lord?
I think it's an excellent question. Yeah, and how long has the combined reign of Manasseh and Ammon been? This has been 57 years of this behavior. And yet Josiah comes up as a boy king, and he's good, right? Yeah, I think one of the things, so, the Bible uses these writings use these echoes all the time. One thing that this echoes to me is the boy king after Athaliah. Now the name is escaping me. What's his name? I keep wanting to say Josiah. This is Josiah. Jehoash. Is that right? No, it's not. Joash. The boy king Joash, right? So the queen mother kills the whole royal family and only the baby survives. And we're told in that one that he was good because he was advised by the priest. It's the priest's wife that rescues him and secrets him away in the temple. And he's raised in the temple, and the priest advises him, and he's good as long as the priest is advising him and he repairs the temple. So we have a lot of similarities between Josiah and Joash, where we wonder if maybe it is the influence of the priests in the temple of the Lord that have helped him. And I think that's the only thing we can do is kind of guess and infer, right? What do y'all think?
I had one thought.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I noticed that it gave his mother's name and her mother's name, which I thought maybe, that he had good parenting there, good mother and good grandmother, kind of like Timothy.
I like it. Now they give the names of the mothers quite often, and I don't know. This is something I've wanted to do more homework on, and I haven't yet. Very often, those mothers, the names don't mean anything to us. We don't know who they are or what they signify, and I don't know if we should, is there some reason we might know more about those mothers, or is that just something that's lost to the chronicles of the books of the kings of Judah?
The other thing that they put in is where she is from. And I'm wondering if there's some significance to the town the mother came from and the influence of that town.
That's a great question.
And it's not always given where the mothers come from, but there are times when certain ones are mentioned.
Yeah, you're right. That's unusual. There was nothing in my commentary, but that it's a great question.
I suspect too that raising children back then by the king was totally different from what we think of daddies and sons. The kids stayed with the mother pretty much until they were much older, before the father had too much to do with them. He didn't want to be bothered with these little kids. And with the many wives and concubines they had, there was more than one child. In fact, if you a present day person, or nearly present, is Winston Churchill. Look how he was raised. His mother and father had very little to do with him, even though he loved them dearly and wanted to be in their presence and be with them. They were too busy with other things. And it wasn't until he was in his teenage years that his mother decided he was worth spending some time with. And so that was, that's just the way it was. They were raised by nannies or other people, and it wasn't daddy and son, So they could not even know their father very well. They're back off over here somewhere else in another palace or house or whatever. And then when they finally got old enough to take power, the father started paying attention to them.
They had to be aware of what was going on around them, though.
Well, sure, they would be, but they wouldn't have any say, and about it. And they could store all this stuff, store this up in their little brains, and say, oh, hey, wait a minute. And then the influence of their mother, and their teachers. And if the teachers were the priest, and they paid attention to that, I can see how it could happen.
But also, you remember the warning that God had in the very beginning not to marry women, that were outside of the Jewish faith or of his people, of the Israelites, because for this very reason, they're going to raise their sons the way that they believe, following the idols and worshiping the idols. Just seems like, let's hear it for the women. Let's hear it for the moms.
I like that. It does say that this is a region in Judah, that city that's mentioned. So I don't think that's a foreign place. It's a place in Judah. I found a little information. So what's the first reform that we learn about?
Building up the temple and fixing the temple and using the temple money.
Yeah, the people are still bringing their offerings and there's financial money available. Lael, what are you saying?
I said money.
Yeah, he uses the money that the people are bringing to repair the temple. So apparently the temple is in disrepair, right? We knew that the altar, the Baal and Asherah worship had been introduced to the temple, but apparently the Lord's temple is also quite in disrepair. And we get a real sense here. So Josiah is a boy king, but he's actually good. And it says he's good like David, but more than that, we're going to see as we go through that he's good like Moses, right? He is a Moses figure in this text. And he starts repairing the temple. He entrusts these workers, just like Moses did with the tabernacle, right? There were these skilled workers that God had given them their skills. And here we see about how these workers are so honest. So we get this, it's like Moses, he's starting to work on the temple. And so, apparently Josiah doesn't know much of what to do, and he starts with working on the temple. And what happens when the temple work begins?
The priest finds the book of the law.
Okay. What is it talking about, the book of the law? What is it? What's in the book of the law?
Is it the Torah? The Ten Commandments? I mean, I don't.
In the Torah, there is a reference, this book of the law, and it's every time it's in Deuteronomy.
Okay.
So it's probably the book of Deuteronomy, which really does, has a version. Remember, the 10 Commandments are in Exodus 20, but they're also again in Deuteronomy. Like, it's a second telling of the law, and it's kind of an encapsulated one. So this is probably the book of Deuteronomy, which tells all the critical things that Israel is supposed to do to follow God, right? And why did the book of the law need to be found?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
I think all of those bad guys hid it so no one would know.
I think you're on to something, right? So Manasseh is killing all the prophets. He's filling Jerusalem end to end with blood. If there are faithful priests, are they putting the book of the law front and center?
Mm-mm.
No, maybe they're going to tuck it away during this long period of bloody apostasy under Manasseh and his son, right? And so there's this sense that, like, either this priest found it or he found it, right? Like, he's like, look what I found, right? Once he sees that Josiah is interested in the Lord's temple, then he goes and presents. He says, well, look what I found, right? You notice he doesn't say, let the king follow this book of the law. He just says, look what I found, right? And how does that go? What's Josiah's reaction?
He tore his clothes.
Yeah, why?
I think he was upsetting that he realized he was repairing the temple, but he realized how horribly off kilter they really were, and that they needed to get back following the Lord truly.
Yeah.
And tearing clothing is a sign of grief and remorsefulness.
Yes, yeah. So he's repenting, right? He learns new information. When he comes to power, he's like, well, let's start repairing the temple, right? But he doesn't apparently know everything that he should be doing according to the book of the law, right? Because of this long period where no one was doing it, right? Even Hezekiah was commended for following the book of the law. So, like, the book of the law was probably available up to the point where Manasseh, takes it over and starts killing people. Probably, lost or hidden during that period. And so it's found. And you see that Josiah knows that the Lord will be angry because he sees the gap in instructions versus behavior. Gary, read for us 15 through 20, please. Oh, 14. Start at 14, please.
Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam, Achbor, Shaphan, and Asaiah went to speak to the prophet Huldah, who was the wife of Shallum, son of Tikvah, son of Harhas, keeper of the wardrobe. She lived in Jerusalem in the new quarter. She said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Tell the man who sent you to me, this is what the Lord says. I am going to bring disaster on this place and its people, according to everything written in the book the king of Judah has read. Because they have forsaken me and burned incense to other gods and roused my anger by all the idols their hands have made, my anger will burn against this place and will not be quenched. Tell the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord, this is what.
Oops, you accidentally muted, Carrie, somehow. There.
Because your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I have spoken against this place and its people, that they would become a curse and be laid waste, and because you tore your robes and wept in my presence, I also have heard you, declares the Lord. Therefore, I will gather you to your ancestors, and you will be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see all the disaster I am going to bring on this place. So they took her answer back to the king.
Okay. So lest we think there were only women prophets in the New Testament, like Philip's 4 daughters and whatever women were prophesying with their head covered versus uncovered, the prophet they consult is Huldah, and she is a woman prophet, but she sounds just like all the other prophets, right? What's the message? Will the Lord relent?
No, disaster is coming.
No, the result is set, but it won't happen to Josiah himself.
Right.
So with this message, would we blame Josiah if he quits bothering with reforms? But what does Josiah do?
He renews the covenant.
He does. Yeah, we see that he's doing what he's doing out of, a sincere willingness to seek the Lord. And so he continues his reforms. Chapter 23. Then the king called together all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. He went up to the temple of the Lord with the men of Judah, the people of Jerusalem, the priests and the prophets, and all the people from the greatest to the least to the greatest. Look here, prophet, priests, and kings. All the people who are to represent God to the people are here before God with the people, right? He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which had been found in the temple of the Lord, like Moses, right? Moses is the one that spoke all those words to the people. Deuteronomy is all put in terms of Moses told the people, right? So we have this kind of new Moses figure here. The king stood by the pillar and renewed the covenant in the presence of the Lord to follow the Lord and keep his commands, regulations, and decrees with all his heart and all his soul, thus confirming the words of the covenant written in the book. And all the people pledged themselves to the covenant as they did under Moses, right? So quite a renewal for the whole land, for all the people. And with the covenant renewed, the reforms begin in earnest, right? There's a pattern to Josiah's actions. Notice he removes articles, and then in verse 4, he burned them outside to Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron Valley and took the ashes to Bethel. He did away with the pagan priests appointed to burn incense in the high places and those who burn incense to Baal and the constellations and the starry host. And he took the Asherah pole from the temple of the Lord, and he took it to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem and burned it there. He ground it to powder and scattered the dust over the graves of common people. Right, so this pattern is that he is not only removing things, but also doing what?
Destroying them.
Yeah, why?
Maybe so they can't be used again or brought back.
Exactly. It says he talks about him desecrating, verse 10, Topeth in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so that no one could use it to sacrifice his son or daughter in the fire to Moloch. So it's the idea that he's defiling these places. He's making them unfit for idolatrous practice, right? And it's something that he, trying to keep his reforms from failing. Right, so he's really working hard on this. And notice Verse 15, even the altar at Bethel, the high place made by Jeroboam son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin, even that altar and high place he demolished. He burned the high place and ground it to powder and burned the Asherah pole. And Josiah looked around, and when he saw the tombs that were there on the hillside, he had the bones removed from them and burned them on the altar to defile it, in accordance with the word of the Lord, proclaimed by the man of God who foretold these things. Haven't we come full circle? Right? Remember, Jeroboam started out, remember when you had the conflict of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, that Rehoboam was very Pharaoh-ish, right? He's like enslaving the people. He's the harsh master. You know, he whipped them with whips, I'll whip them with scorpions. Like, you know, he said, Jeroboam sounds like Pharaoh. And I'm sorry, Rehoboam sounds like Pharaoh, and Jeroboam comes along sounding like Moses. And yet then when he goes off and starts his kingdom, which God had told him to do and had blessed, he turns into someone more like Aaron, making these golden calves, right? It was that fall from God's will, and that had invited, you know, God had then sent the prophet to speak against the altar and say, this altar will be burned and desecrated, right? And finally, all these generations later, this thing has happened. So, you know, we're really seeing the completion of the word of the Lord. We talked about how the faithfulness of the word of the Lord is such a theme here, and it's happened here where he's finishing the thing that the Lord promised. And then they all have a Passover, and it's, you know, it's a Passover like they hadn't had even under David. You know, he's very Moses-y again. So it says there was no king like him in turning to the Lord, and yet God did not relent. Why not? Why do you think God did not relent? Verse 26, nevertheless, God did not turn away from the heat of his fierce anger which burned against Judah.
Because of
Gone
Manasseh.
too far for too long.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense that like they were too deep in it at this point. It was already set. And notice what happens next. Turn over to the very end of chapter 23. After Josiah dies, Jehoaz, his son, takes over. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And then his son, Jehoiakim, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the people go right back to the evil behavior. And so the Lord's pronouncements against them stands. Right? We'll pick up next week with chapter 24 and 25, where we get that final, you know, fall into captivity. But we see here, you know, we had a new David with Hezekiah, but when it came to self-sacrifice, he wasn't interested. He was good, but he didn't help the people in the way that they needed. And now we've had a new Moses who changed the forms of worship. They needed to be done. All those things needed to happen. But then evil kings came right after him. And we need a new David. We need a new Moses that cannot just change the forms, right? We need a new Moses who can change the hearts of the people, who's willing to give him up himself, like Hezekiah was not, to make us new. You know, so this all, you know, our authors, as they're detailing this out, they're talking about the fall, but they're pointing forward, aren't they? They're pointing forward to someone who will rescue us in a way that we really need to be rescued. The exilic prophet Ezekiel prophesied, this is in Ezekiel 36, beginning in verse 24. For I will take you from the nations, this is after they've gone, gather you from all the lands and bring you to your own land, and I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean, and I will cleanse you from all of your filthiness and from all of your idols. Moreover, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh. This Josiah couldn't do it, right? The heart of stone is still there. We see it in the next behavior of the people. and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you will be careful to observe my ordinances, and you will live in the land that I gave your forefathers, so that you will be my people and I will be your God. It all points forward to whom?
Jesus.
It's all pointing to Jesus, right? The Jesus, he said he came to give his life as a ransom for many, so that the ways of these kings, even when they do well, still don't bring us what we really need, the heart of flesh, the Spirit of the Lord within us, like Jesus does. It all points forward to our true hope and our true rescue in the person of Jesus Christ. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thank you for the good discussion. And I will turn it over for our prayer time.
Thank you,
Thank you
Deanna.
so much, Deanna. Good
Thank you,
lessons.
Deanna.
Our prayer today